Because my father's mother and their people weren't slaves, and that isn't going to deliver me the cash, is it? I'll stick with my black Jamaican mother.
By black, do you mean people of African descent?
Yes.
Okay.
We aren't them, right? These people are no longer with us.
So those that resisted enslavement, they were seeking their freedom, which was restitution of their dignity, their humanity, and their right to be free, their right to go to their homelands.
Welcome back to Rattlesnake TV, guys. In this video, we are going to be watching a 2-on-2 debate on the subject of reparations. This is an interesting one, and one that's also very telling, as you'll see. Now, the first speaker is Kehinde Andrews. He's a professor of Black Studies at the University of Birmingham and the author of The Psychosis of Whiteness, which, just imagine if that title was the other way around. He's also on record saying there's nothing a white person can do about racism. The only solution to the problem, the Birmingham University professor argues, is to unite Africa and the African diaspora in a true revolution. So that kind of tells you everything you need to know about this man's worldview. Let's get into it.
And your tax money, you will be happy to know, merrily happy to know, went into helping end slavery. But how did it do this? It did this because in order to end the system of slavery, the government paid the biggest bailout in the history of the UK economy to the slave owners. They actually paid reparations to the slave owners. A figure so large, they had to take out a loan from the Treasury, a loan that was so big, they only paid it back in 2015. Which means that me, descendant of slaves, my mum, descendant of slaves, my dad, descendant of slaves, and half of you in the room, potentially descendant of slaves, all paid slavery reparations to slave owners. So the principle has already been established that reparations are due. The question is, who are they due to? This didn't just happen in the UK. Denmark, Holland, Spain, all paid reparations to slave owners. In fact, Haiti, as I already mentioned, the price of their freeing themselves, liberating themselves from France, was in 1825. They submitted to a 150 million franc debt to the French in reparation to who? Slave owners. An amount of money so large that it took 122 years for Haiti to pay off. In fact, one of the reasons Haiti is the poorest country in the world today is because of it had to pay that debt off for 122 years. So when we talk about the idea of slavery being something in the past, we are being completely ignorant. The biggest lie the West will tell you is that when they encountered Africa, Asia, the other parts of the world, they were advanced. And because of this advancement, we were able to have capitalism and what we call so-called civilization, right? This is actually untrue. In 1492, Europe was coming out of a dark age and was the only place on the planet that was in a dark age at that period of time. Europe was not advanced in 1492. Europe had to unveil itself to the Eastern empires in order to get into them. And one of the primary ways that Europe and the West became rich was through the enslavement of African people. The 300-year cycle of the triangular trade that generated so much wealth, it accelerated the Western capitalism and built the world we have today. Time doesn't stop after the enslavement of African people. When slavery ends, what happens? So Britain, my family has said Jamaica, you are left with a place in a country which is built on a plantation economy. That's all it is. There's nothing else there. There's no other development than plantation economy. You are left with nothing to show for your labor for the last 300 years. You are left in absolute destitute poverty. You also, slavery ends and colonialism then continues. It's not like it just stopped and ended and finished. Malcolm X has a quote where he says, if you stab a knife 9 inches into my back and only take it out 3 inches, that's not progress. Even if you take the knife all the way out, that's still not progress. Unless you heal the wound, no progress has been made. Unfortunately, the knife is still firmly in our backs, right? Nothing has been done to redress the balance, which explains why places like Jamaica are extraordinarily poor, which explains why my family migrated from Jamaica to this country and experienced racism and still experience racism today. If you want to understand why the world is the way the world is, why racial oppression is here in America, in the Caribbean, and in Africa. Remember, millions of people taken from Africa. The impact on the African economy was devastating. What slavery did was it ushered in a world of white supremacy, the creation of the Negro, the idea that I am not fully human and can be used as a beast of burden. It created the idea of white supremacy, black on the bottom, white on the top, and everybody else in between. And if you look today at global inequality, what do you see? Africa, black at the bottom. The West, largely white at the top. And everybody else in between. The legacy of slavery is not something past, it is something with us. And there is a substantial debt owed to those who suffered from it.
So the next speech really puts that one to shame, but just to touch on a few of those points. He mentioned there that the reason why Haiti is the poorest country in the world is because they had to pay all of this debt back to the French. Well, first of all, they're not the only country that has had to pay a lot of debt back. Secondly, he's not without a point that Haiti's had a tough run in terms of their history, but it's certainly not just the fault of Westerners. And this needs to be said because the cornerstone of their worldview is essentially this Pan-African revolution fantasy. They look at white Westerners as evil oppressors and Africans as benevolent victims. I mean, do you think that Haiti would be richer, more prosperous, higher life expectancy if colonialism hadn't have happened? Because as the world continues to develop and globalize, you can't stay isolated like you're the North Sentinelese people. Somebody is going to come along and it's just a matter of who. So let's have a good old-fashioned dive into Haitian history, which is actually super interesting before we get into the next speaker. Because you guys know, any excuse for me to go on a mildly relevant historical tangent. So prior to European colonization, Haiti was inhabited by the Taino people. We don't know much about them, but they were indigenous people of the Caribbean whose societies were agricultural hunter-gatherer societies, similar to the Mayans and other Native American people in that they were divided into chiefdoms or communities which saw chiefs or supreme leaders ruling with warriors under them who were above manual workers, etc. In fact, the name Haiti or Haiti means land of high mountains, which is a Taino word. Then Columbus came along and he loved the culture, writes about how gentle and nice they were, and named the island La Hispaniola. Devastatingly, the Taino people were wiped out to near extinction due to disease, and according to National Geographic, a 1565 census showed that there were only 200 Tainos left on Haiti, and none by 1800. During this time, slaves were brought over from West Africa, and the French took over the colony in 1697. And before the Haitian Revolution, Haiti was the world's top producer for sugar and coffee and amongst other goods. And then in 1791, the slaves staged a revolt. I mean, fair play to them, wouldn't you? This revolt forced the French to withdraw before the Haitians declared independence in 1802, to which end our little old mate Napoleon Bonaparte said, "No thank you boys, stay in your lane, yeah?" But the Haitians ended up winning that war too, causing Napoleon to withdraw before they declared independence again in 1804 and literally went and massacred the rest of the French population on the island, resulting in over 5,000 deaths of women and children as revenge for Napoleon's invasion. White people were hung from gallows along the coastline to signal to passing ships that the island had been purged of its Europeans. Haiti then became an empire and descended into chaos with revolts and coups, etc. before the US occupied them for a bit in the 20th century. Then they left and Papa Doc Duvalier ruled from 57 to 86 in one of the most brutal regimes in modern history. Then more coups and a massive earthquake in 2010, then the Clintons, and then just last year, Haiti was left with no elected government.
As of this week, all 11.5 million people living in Haiti no longer have an elected official representing them.
After the last remaining officials left office, leaving a power vacuum in the country filled by roaming gangs.
The U.S. Embassy in Haiti is urging citizens to leave the country.
So, I mean, many different factors involved with why Haiti is where it is today. None more than civil wars and infighting, as well as the brutal internal repression that governments and gangs have inflicted upon their own people. So no, not all just the fault of white people. And actually, when you do stage this revolution, which the Haitians did with the French, then the result of that is not just an African utopia. And Haiti is not the only example of that. You can look at Liberia as well as other countries. But anyways, let's get on to the next speaker now, Catherine Burble-Singh. Catherine's a brilliant woman and truly a visionary in the field of education. Known as Britain's strictest head teacher, her school, Michaela Community College, is amongst the best ranking in the country and dominates its peers. And here's what they say on their website. Our teaching is outstanding. Why? Because our teachers lead the learning. Our desks are in rows and the teachers stand at the front of the class and lead the children to new and exciting destinations. This requires sharp explanations, checking for understanding, and a belief that the teacher is the authority in the classroom. based? This explains a lot about why their results are so much better than other schools. Because we live in a world right now of participation trophies, and we live in a world where children can identify as cats or ponies when they go to school, and the teacher has to affirm that. They also have high expectations of behavior. Why? Because without excellent discipline, learning cannot take place. Children are polite and helpful with a genuine interest in helping their peers. This can only happen in an environment that expects the very best of them. Discipline in a world of little TikTok brains? Don't you just love to see it? So safe to say, I'm a fan of what this woman does. She's not just sitting there complaining and asking for things. She's actually taking action. And her opening statements, pretty base. Let's get into it.
Well, I don't actually disagree with lots of what Kehinde said, except for his conclusion, of course, that reparations should be paid. Slavery was an abomination, and if you read about the terrible things done to slaves, it's hard not to cry. But today's debate isn't about whether or not slavery was bad or good. It's about whether the West should pay reparations for slavery. Which West ought to pay? The Portuguese who brought the slaves, the Dutch who provided the boats, the British who provided the insurance, the Portuguese, Spanish, and French who ran the largest colonies? And what of the African people who sold their brothers and sisters in exchange for guns, allowing them to grow their own kingdoms? Then there's Brazil. Is it part of the West? Of the 12 million Africans that were shipped across the Atlantic, Brazil received nearly 5 million of them. So why are we only discussing whether the West should pay for reparations for slavery? Hard to come up with an answer. So let's put aside the complexities of who might pay for these reparations and turn our minds instead to who might be the specific recipients of the money. What I want to know is, what am I going to get out of this? I mean, after all, I'd quite like a new car. Perhaps I could upgrade my flat and get something nice just off the corner of Oxford Street. And I'm definitely entitled. Yes, sorry, my parents come from the Caribbean. My mother is Black Jamaican. But then my father, well, he doesn't really come from slaves. He's Indo-Caribbean from Guyana. Of course, his people were indentured servants. When slavery was abolished, Indians were taken to the Caribbean to take the place of the slaves who had been freed. Somebody had to do the work. My father's family lived in the same huts as the slaves once did, were tied to the same families as the slaves once were. Just instead of my father's grandparents being bought and sold, instead it was their contract of indenture that was bought and sold and obligated them to work for the time period set by their owners. The conditions were horrific. My illiterate grandmother might have told you all about this herself, had the poverty and environment that engulfed Indian indentured laborers in the Caribbean not been so grotesque that she died when my father was only 6 years old. But I'll forget that story, because my father's mother and their people weren't slaves, and that isn't going to deliver me the cash, is it? I'll stick with my Black Jamaican mother.
Just before we get to the next clip, guys, if you don't mind smashing that like button really quickly, that helps me enormously with my algorithms. I really appreciate it. And also, if you're getting value from the content, if you would like to see more, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Back to it.
Not sure what we do with people like Kamala Harris, one of the candidates for the Democratic nomination of the US presidency. Her mother is from India. Her father is from Jamaica. Her father admits that his family owned slaves. Does she get a piece of the pie? Barack Obama is black, but his mother is white and descends from slave owners, like so many mixed-race people. So do they get half payments instead of full payments? How is this all meant to work anyway? I'll tell you one way in which it might work. There are various websites out there right now in 2019, this is mainly an American thing, where black people are getting white people to donate money to them, in the guise of reparations. So I'll read out one of these sites to you. It's a real site run by a black American woman who right now is collecting cash from white people because of reparations owed to her. So there are instructions for black people and for white people here. So for black people in the audience, listen up. Number one, if you are black and a descendant of chattel slavery, please put your PayPal, Venmo, and/or Cash App in the comments of this post. Number two, you do not have to plead your case or share why you are participating. Being black is enough. So black people in the audience, you want some extra money to go out on the weekend? Just get your PayPal information on there. Now, white people, these are the guidelines. Number one, realizing that you have white privilege or that you are inherently racist is not sufficient. Okay? It's not sufficient to recognize that you have white privilege. Take action that gives your power away, white people. So right now, think of that action. What's it going to be? Number two, This is not a substitute for reparations from the government. This should be every politician's platform. Are you demanding this from them, white people? Are you writing to your local MP and demanding reparations? Number 3, you can give $1, $5, $10, $50, $100, $1,000, $10,000. Whatever works for you. Little smiley face. So you can give this young woman $10,000 and get rid of your white guilt. Now, this young woman leaves out of the equation that slavery isn't just black and white. The first point is that everyone had slaves, okay? People of all colors became slaves for economic reasons, because of war, because slavery, as odious as it was simply a normal way of life. Arabs were extracting millions of black African slaves centuries before Christian nations did, for about 13 centuries, compared to the 3 centuries European nations ran the Atlantic slave trade. Arabs marched African slaves across the Sahara Desert, and as such, they died more often. It was customary to castrate them, and many died from this practice. The Arabs also enslaved over 1 million white European Christians. The term slavery, in fact, comes from the word Slav. The Slavs inhabited Eastern Europe and were taken by the Muslims of Spain in the 9th century, not to mention that Africans had been enslaving each other for thousands of years. The point is that slavery, the second point is that slavery was not about race, and that's important. It was not about race. The only reason we think it's about race is because philosophers like David Hume in the 18th century ranked human beings and put Africans at the bottom, saying that they had no souls. The Enlightenment imposed the concept of race on a practice that had been going on for centuries in order to justify that practice. And why did they have to justify it? And this is the point. Because people in the West began to question slavery's moral validity. The fact is that people of all colors owned slaves, both as part of the Atlantic slave trade and outside of it. In the United States and Caribbean, black people owned thousands of black slaves, and so did the Native Americans. Nearly 20,000 of the Native American 5 civilized tribes sided with the Confederacy during the Civil War, fighting to keep slavery alive. 28% of the black population who were free in New Orleans pledged their support to the Confederacy. All of the 13 southern states of the Confederacy had substantial numbers of black slave owners. There were more than 250,000 free blacks, and nearly 4,000 of them were slave masters who owned more than 20,000 slaves. The practice of slavery was legal, after all. We need to remember that governments did not own slaves. Slave owners did. In fact, the US government fought a war to end slavery. How much should the descendants of the 400,000 Union soldiers who lost their lives fighting to free the slaves pay to the descendants of the slaves they freed? It's bizarre to suggest that human beings should inherit the outrage of the deeds of their parents. Should the child born from a rapist be branded a rapist because of his father's criminality? Should the child of a mass murderer be sent to prison because of his father's crime? No. In America, in the main, it was the Democrats who owned slaves, and the Democrats who in the main passed and enforced Jim Crow laws. It was also the Democrats who founded the Ku Klux Klan. Should the current Democratic Party be held responsible for this? No, we do not inherit the sins of our fathers. Aside from the fact that it would be simply impossible to make reparations work in any sensible or practical way, one must ask whether it would be helpful to the people one is trying to help. And this is key, because we assume that reparations are going to help them. Giving people lump sums of money does not work. Economists often point to the Georgia Land Lottery of 1832, in which parcels of land were distributed randomly. What happened to the descendants of those who were lucky enough to be given this land? Are they the richest families in Georgia? No. In fact, within one generation after the distribution of the Georgia land, one could not distinguish between those who had been given land and those who hadn't. Certainly my own direct experiences of working for 20 plus years in the inner city with families on welfare demonstrates this time and time again. Rather than give a man a fish, it is always better to teach him how to fish. All giving the fish does is make the giver feel better. Reparations might relieve white people of their guilt, but it will do little else. So back to my initial question. Why are we only discussing whether the West should pay reparations for slavery? Because while slavery was common to all civilizations, only one civilization developed a moral revulsion against it very late in its history, Western civilization. Not even the leading moralists in other civilizations rejected slavery at all. Rather than be ashamed as Westerners, we should stand proud for having led the world out of a mentality where slavery was the norm, and we should vote against this motion.
So all I could really do there is maybe summarize her points or just agree, because as far as logic goes, I think that argument is essentially impregnable.
My style is impetuous, my defense is impregnable, and I'm just ferocious. I want your heart.
I mean, she's a beast, and you can see why she'd be such a good teacher in a world full of blue-haired, communist, non-binary, they-them educators. It's comforting to know that there are still some serious people pioneering the education industry. Anyways, this next one is just hilarious and cringe. And just to set the stage, the next speaker is Esther Stanford Tracy, who is a Pan-African reparations activist, meaning that she advocates for Pan-Africanism. This is an attempt to create some sort of collaboration and brotherhood amongst people with African descent, whether they're living on the continent or not. And this, in theory, sounds like a good thing. Africans coming together, unifying their wealth and natural resources, trying to lift themselves up as a collective and become the benevolent economic superpower that they should be, and creating world peace while they're at it. Because of course, Africans are benevolent and peaceful, and whites are bad and do slavery. Well, that's until you realize that Africans have more brutal, murderous infighting amongst themselves than anywhere else in the world, with the continent basically plagued with civil wars and disasters at every moment, north, east, south, and west. And then you just have to take a cursory look at the government structures and the gross amount of corruption that takes place, with governments constantly embezzling all of the money and foreign aid and leaving their people to starve and fight amongst themselves.
We are angry, but we don't know what can we do. They take net our money, houses. No, where is that money?
So, the idea that Western countries will pay massive amounts of reparations and that African leaders will all just come together and distribute the wealth appropriately for the betterment of Mummy Africa is just, unfortunately, delusional. Now, I want you guys to watch this lady very carefully, because throughout this entire video, she says a lot of words whilst saying absolutely nothing. It's just basically one big virtue signal the whole time. And it's actually impressive how one person can say so much with so little.
My argument is that reparations for chattel enslavement is not just about the period of chattel enslavement. In fact, in 2001, Human Rights Watch helpfully expounded, when addressing relatively old wrongs, we would base claims of reparations not on the past abuses of chattel enslavement itself, but on its contemporary effects. That is, we would focus on people who can reasonably claim that today they personally suffer the effects of past human rights violations through continuing economic or social deprivation. And when it comes to the matter of crimes against humanity, the right to reparations does not get extinguished with the death of the original victims, but can be pursued by his or her heirs. Hence why we in PARCO, the Pan-African Reparations Coalition that I represent, initiated the Stop the Maangamizi, We Charge Genocide Ecocide campaign, which was inspired by the holistic and historic call of Africans in America under the auspices of the Civil Rights Congress of the USA in 1951, who sought to bring the United States government to account for the crimes of genocide against African people in America. Even under traditional human rights law and policy, it is expected that governments that practice or tolerate systemic, structural, and institutionalized anti-Black African prejudice and racial discrimination and its specific form of Afrophobia, that they should actually compensate the victims and certainly bring about an end to this condition. So reparations are not a divisive issue. They are the only approach that can transform our broken and divided societies. According to the same United Nations guidelines on reparations, an essential aspect of reparations include an opportunity for victims, and in international law, the descendants of the enslaved are classified as victims, not in the way that we use it in popular speak, but it means that we have a right to claim a remedy and be recognised in law. We in the Stop the Maangamizi campaign believe that establishing this all-party parliamentary commission of inquiry will go a long way towards institutionalising a reparative, truth-seeking process that will contribute to healing and restoring the descendants of the enslaved and facilitating racial justice and equity between the descendants of the enslaved as well as the enslavers today and, of course, in wider society. However, such repair of the relationship between people of African descent and the rest of society cannot take place without public acknowledgement of the crimes against African people and their descendants over 5 centuries and counting, and without UK governmental action to enable redress and reparation for the brutal injustices committed not only in the past, but which still continue into the present. That is my case. The West should pay reparations for slavery by taking responsibility for living up to their declarations of respecting human rights and the rule of law.
There's this weird point that gets brought up amongst these activists sometimes, where they suggest that they would like Africa to be brought back to how it was pre-colonialism. Why don't we go to Africa, destroy all of the infrastructure built by Europeans, take away all of the medicine, the food, the clothing, and everything else bought by Europeans, and restore it to its old state? Because that's what reparations really means, apparently. And they can all live in harmony, because I'm sure that's exactly what they were doing before the Europeans came over. And furthermore, it's more than just money. The West needs to take responsibility for being these evil, disgusting slave traders hundreds of years ago, whilst Africa still practices slavery. And how do we know when these evil Westerners have taken that responsibility? Well, probably when they give heaps and heaps of money. The level of rose-colored glasses that these people see Africa with and Africans is actually hilarious. It's almost like they don't know anyone from Africa and they've never been there, because if you actually speak to people who have lived in these African countries, they'll be the first ones to tell you about the level of corruption, which is why they are jumping on little dingy boats to get to Europe. It's like they've just watched some Madagascar and believe that that's actually how Africa is, and they think that white people are just so uniquely evil, when in reality, people just do messed up things. This is complicated. Anyways, the next speaker is Thomas Sewell. He's an educational consultant and the CEO of a charity called Generating Genius. And throughout his career, he's helped to set up education centers and enhance education opportunities for underprivileged people. And he has a different and pretty interesting perspective on Pan-Africanism and the way forward for African people.
I want to argue this at a different angle. I want to argue that reparations is actually a regressive step for black majority countries and black individuals, and I say that in a generic sense, and because it mainly gives too much power and agency actually to white people. I actually think that the arguments placed just before, is that they're actually a bit too soft. I think they need to go further, and I think in some ways, I mean, what I mean by go further, I mean in terms of really what. I suppose we could talk about the agency and power of black people themselves and what they bring to this. And if you look at the leaders, Booker T. Washington, Malcolm X, the Black Power movement, Maya Angelou, Oprah, and the key figure here is Marcus Garvey, the father, if you like, the father figure of Pan-Africanism. Not really interested in reparations, really. And if you look at their work, what they're actually arguing for is something completely opposite. In fact, they're arguing for, in fact, they see it as a kind of way in which it's a continual kind of step backwards, because white people are there and we're begging for some money. Africa as a site for opportunity not as this broke down place that we have to kind of give money to, and all the kinds of notions we have about Africa, all the negative notions. I actually think some of the reparations debate and the people who support it add to that negativity. And of course, the notion of success. Bloody hell, when you hear these people talking about the state of black people, you just feel like you want to go out and sort of hang yourself or something. They're so depressing. They're so fucking depressing. And I think that really, we want to see, I see myself as a successful black man. I see myself as a positive black man. I see black women in terms of a positive future. And I think that one of the things that the great African leaders that I see, the Garveys, the Oprahs, the Maya Angelou's, can come to this in a way that is completely different and a different mindset at this. And in fact, it almost is in line with holding us back. Oprah, let's just give one example. Oprah says once she has in her hallway of Winfrey a picture of a woman who's just been emancipated from slavery. And she's looking out and she's to the new world. And she says, she remembers what Maya Angelou said to her. Maya Angelou says this, baby, your crown has been paid for, so put it on your head and wear it. In other words, my ancestors have already done all the hard work. They've already done all the reparations. Yeah? Bob Marley makes a beautiful song where he talks about the whole idea of the songs that he's created as being redemption songs. Now, people don't really, they sing that song and they don't really understand what he's saying. What he's really saying is, look, we Jamaicans, we've already unpacked it for ourselves. The vase that was broken and then we had to put it back together in all different bits. But we put it back together, even though it wasn't the same, we put it back together creatively and we created a new culture and we created a new music and we created a new identity right inside slavery. So we don't need white people to come along and give us anything. Which country in Africa at the moment is one of the fastest growing, one of the fastest growing economies? Can you name the country? Come on, tell me, which one? Which one? Kenya. Not really, nearly. I'll tell you which one it is. And this is the one that is surprising. It's Ethiopia. Here is the country. Remember Band-Aid? Do you remember the little children down there with the flies around them? And remember you having to pour in all that money into Ethiopia? And really and truly, the outcome of all that money went nowhere. Ethiopia, and I'll just quote this, is predicted to grow by 8.5% this year. This is no kind of country, little country there with little mud huts and kids flying around. This is a serious country. Now, why is it? And the issue is, it's not about reparations, it's about investment. What's happened is Ethiopia has decided, right, here are the terms between the West and us. What's going to happen now, and it's been the Chinese that's understood this the best, is that you can come and invest in us. And investment means you're a real person then, because you get something out of it, we get something out of it. And we're grown-ups now. And that's the model for Africa. And that's the model for us also psychologically as well. You talk about the issue of the psychological problems around slavery and what it's done to black people. One of the biggest issues I find, I run a charity called Generating Genius, believe that? A lot of my kids are black. A lot of my kids have come to me in terms of my program, really not going for much, and then ending up doing in the top companies doing in the sciences. And simply all I've said to them is forget all the negative kind of things said about you, not only about in terms of the racism, but also in terms of other black people saying you can't do it because you're black. or because white people have to give you reparations, have to allow you to do it before you can be successful. So when I'm arguing today, my argument is a different kind of angle on this, is that I think that part of the problem we're facing is actually within our own community. And I speak directly to black communities here. Part of our own problem in terms of seeing ourselves totally as victims.
So, interesting guy, and in my opinion, that's more of an empowering way to speak to people, rather than this cancerous victim mindset that just keeps people down perpetually. So now let's have a look at the back and forth that takes place, which is so cringe at times. And honestly, the moderator is very biased as well, but let's check it out.
So the next question was directed to you as well, Tony. I think some of it's been covered in what we've just discussed, but we can touch on it briefly. So in the US, white people, descendants of Europeans, benefited from educational advantages that they were given, many advantages that they were given, educational, professional, etc. How do you respond to that, given that the argument you make is that black people are not deserving of being given any of those advantages? How do black people, the descendants of African slaves, catch up with the advantages that have been given to every other racial group?
Okay, so it's important to just say as well, of course there have been advantages. Of course, you know, when you say why weren't blacks given anything, well, because that's the history. I mean, nobody's saying that was right? Nobody's saying that that blacks haven't had a hard time. This idea of what is owed to us, what is owed to them.
Do you mean people of African descent?
Yes.
Okay.
When we say what is owed to them, we aren't them, right? These people are no longer with us. The problem is that identity politics it forces us to see everyone in a particular group, as opposed to seeing people as individuals. And as I was saying, you know, the child of a rapist should not have to carry the burden of his father's crimes. It's important to recognize that people are individuals, and those individuals are responsible for the things that they do.
But how does one account for other groups who are perceived as groups being given certain advantages?
Well, look, can I just
so it was unfair.
Yeah,
I mean, there's no question, right?
And how do we
unfair.
redress that now? And how do people of African descent catch up with those advantages? Would anyone on the
well, in terms of
side
catching up,
jump in?
I mean, I'm one for talking about education. You know, I'm a headmistress. I believe very much in the power of education. I believe that if we were able to give all of our children an excellent education, that individuals born into poverty can change their stars. There are currently in the world 20 million slaves. It is bizarre that we are talking about slavery from hundreds of years ago, when right now in this world, there are 20 million slaves from North Korea to India, gender mistreatment of women across various countries. But we don't talk about these.
Kehinde spoke very specifically about the legacy that endures to this day and how this amount of money was only paid off in 2015 and how we very much live with the afterlife of slavery. Would you like to respond to this in any way, Esther or Kehinde?
Yeah. I mean, look, for me, this red herring of saying that, well, every society had slavery and so we don't have to deal with it is very problematic. We're talking about a specific experience that happened to a group. And I'm talking as somebody who claims that African identity that has been denied me and many others, and many of us who are, you know, that's part of the restitution, which is a principle of reparations. So we have to redefine the languages that we use and stop infusing Eurocentric ideas and perspectives into essentially what is an issue about us as African people, okay? And we need to have cognitive justice in the way that we even talk about our ancestors. Our ancestors lived through us. This is not an academic debate for some of us, okay? So we are them, and that is why some of us are raised in this time to continue the struggle that they began. Every successive generation of African people from the beginning of chattel enslavement in the 1400s has championed reparations. And I explained what reparations mean in international law. You cannot reduce reparations to money and compensation. So those that resisted enslavement, they were seeking their freedom, which was restitution of their dignity, their humanity, and their right to be free, their right to go to their homelands.
And what would you say to Tony's argument that this approach is unhelpful and that it keeps black people locked in a sort of victim mentality?
Well, no, I mean, I think I want to, because part of this is this idea that, you know, the people who are, it's an individual thing and the criminals aren't here anymore. That's absolute nonsense. In the UK, we have what we call the Proceeds of Crime Act, right? If you profit from a crime, if my dad profits from a crime, I guarantee you, government's going to take that money from me. And that's what we're talking about. Okay, the slavers aren't here, but their profits are here, and they are the things which are benefiting the others, and are disadvantaging us, right? So when you're saying that the idea that reparations is somehow bad for us, negative for us, I'm looking at Sister Esther, reparations activist. Some of the most active people in the community today are around the issue of reparations. It is simply nonsense, actually, and quite offensive. What's being said is, this damage has been done to us, restitution is owed, and when we get this restitution, we'll go and do what we like. Right? Nobody's asking for white approval. They're just saying we should get paid what we like.
Can I come in here now? I think that that's the problem. That in fact we're waiting. It's like the rivers of Babylon. We're waiting and we're weeping down there until white people come and save us. Now, what I'm arguing for is that. No, let me finish. What I'm arguing for is I share your passion equally, probably more, for the injustices done to my ancestors. But when I look at what I see in terms of Jamaica, in terms of Trinidad, in terms of Ethiopia and Africa, I don't see a crushed people. I don't see a people who have been totally wiped out because of slavery and colonialism. I see a people really, in a sense, already been inventing themselves, resisting, repairing themselves, and also needing now, in a sense, to kind of join the world. One of the things that when my ancestors came off of the plantation, the project really was this: how do we join the world again? How do we reconnect? Because we've been cut off from it all these years, and that really was a mindset. What's gone wrong, and I agree with Catherine here, is that politics came along, and you talk about the Black Power movement, and you talk about people like Marion Angelou and Marcus Garvey and all these other great black leaders. They were not talking about reparations in that identity politics sense. What they were talking about was the fact that black people themselves could change the world, could have the resources, could have the self-reliance to move on. Now, you're talking about the fact that, okay, in order to move on, we need X amount of resource to do it. Yeah, of course you do need that. But what the relationship is no longer one about begging for this thing or asking for reparations in the past. What it is actually saying, invest in me now, work with me now, because we can actually help the world, we can change the world. There's a much more positive way of looking at it. And I just think that the idea that Africa is not going to be, in the future, one of the greatest spaces on the planet is not. China is not going into Africa just because it's there. There are great resources there. The people themselves are so talented,
and they're taking them.
Exactly. Exactly. and resources are there. Let me finish. Resources are there.
I'm going to jump in there because I would like to take 2 more questions, which I think we have time for. We started slightly late, so we'll go slightly over.
So just so biased and cringe, when Catherine is absolutely spitting facts and when her side is absolutely just spitting facts, the audience groans and sighs. But when the virtue signaling victims start whinging, everybody is applauding and cheering.
And what
Catherine comes out and says, if we want to be bridging this gap, we got to be focusing on educating the next generation of people. She claims that if we want to make a difference in the world, then we have to provide these young people with a good education so that they can go out and be productive. And my school and what I'm doing with my life is living proof of the efficacious nature of that approach. And then Mama Africa comes out in an angry tone and says, I'm a victim. Reparations, Eurocentric, restitution, my ancestors, victim, give me money.
I understand you want people to like you more and think you're cool. Is that right?
Yeah.
All right, well, let's see how this brand works for you. We got Kyle, rugged, vegan, compassionate victim.
On to the last bit now.
Was what about the argument, which is one of the arguments that those who are against reparations make, that the process of reparations could incite more social unrest and could cause resentment with the right or with white interest groups?
Well, when people...
A very short answer.
When people lose things, they often get upset. But sometimes people have to lose things. And if that is what makes things fairer, then you just have to accept that people won't be happy about it. I mean, you can't... I mean, this is part of the problem with a lot of our politics, is that we have tried to keep everybody happy. No one was worried about keeping us happy when they were enslaving us for 300 years, or imprisoning us at mass rates, or the police are shooting us in the streets. So again, what you often have with these arguments is we're expected to be morally superior and have these crazy expectations that we're not expecting from the master, if you like. The other thing I really want to say about this is the question here is, should the West pay reparations? And it's actually a very simple argument. No, this is not complicated. The West is, we know what the West is. The West is very clearly defined, right? Historically, contemporarily. The West used a system of slavery which was utterly based on race. The idea is not based on race. It's a complete offensive fantasy. I'm sorry. There were other systems of slavery. The system of slavery we're talking about was based on the racial exploitation of enslaved Africans. This enriched the West beyond all manner of identity, and you have already paid reparations. You paid them to slave owners, and this should make you mad and burn inside. And it is also and to the question that somebody asked before, you can actually calculate it. So in America, it's estimated it's about $15 trillion that the enslaved are owed. You can go back and say unpaid labor, you can go back and say distress, etc., etc. All of these things which are enshrined in international law, it is perfectly possible to come up with a number and say the West should pay for it. Because it's difficult to work out how that happens, that does not mean it should not happen. And the question we're asking today is, should it happen? And of course it should.
Thank you. On that note, I'm going to ask each of the speakers, working in reverse order, to just take 1 minute to sum up their position, and then we'll have the results of the vote. So I'll start with you, Tony.
Yeah, I mean...
And 1 minute.
Yeah, you'll get 1 minute. I mean, my argument is this, is that I think that it's really now about the discourse around this. And what I mean by discourse is the sense that what we are looking at here is a situation where I believe on a national basis and on an individual basis that, in fact, the whole notion of reparations is actually regressive because it doesn't recognize 3 things. It doesn't recognize this powerful tool of self-reliance that we've used and we're using within slavery as well to help us. And we've shifted to almost that victim mentality. It doesn't realize Africa as a site for opportunity because it always has to position Africa as sort of diminished so that more money can be poured into it. And also the notion of success, that black people in themselves are successful and can do, and that the world for them is a positive space. It doesn't want to do that. It wants to continually remind us and remind our young people that the whole thing is a nightmare.
I have to jump in there because we're seriously over time, but thank you. Esther, I'll come to you now. If you could sum up in 1 minute, please.
Sure. There is a debt owed, but it's not just a financial debt. Now we're also recognising an ecological debt, and the climate and ecological emergency is disproportionately impacting African people in Africa and the African diaspora, where there was chattel enslavement and colonisation. Reparations under international law means full repair. It's holistic, restitution, guarantees of non-repetition, compensation, rehabilitation, and satisfaction. And finally, I'd just like to say that ultimately the restitution is about the restoration of African self-determination, African sovereignty. In this day and age, 101 British corporations control over 1 trillion worth of Africa's key energy and mineral resources. This is not about what happened yesterday. We can't do anything about that, but we can sure as hell stop the Maangamizi of today.
Thank you. Catherine, if you could sum up in 1 minute, please.
Yeah, well, I don't think practically reparations can work. I think that if we continually talk about reparations instead of thinking how to uplift certain communities, thinking about education, for instance, and how that can help, and instead indulge in victimhood, which it doesn't help anyone. It isn't helpful. And slavery was a grave stain on our history, but there are 20 million slaves that exist nowadays, and I think we should be more interested in bettering that situation and bettering the lives of people who are in difficulty in this country by investing our time in programs and education and so on to help them raise up from the poor situations that they're in.
So a really telling debate there in terms of the way that we discuss these issues around history and reparations and slavery and all of these hot button issues. The more notable intellectuals who engage in this debate from the left want to play the victim and absolutely do not want to hear a peep from anybody who actually has a real world practical solution that doesn't involve playing the victim. You must affirm victimhood rather than mentioning anything about taking responsibility for your own future. They don't want to hear it because it's a far more difficult conversation to have and it's a far more difficult message to sell. So, anyways, guys, enough rambling from me today. Check out my links below, and also if you'd like to subscribe if you haven't already, right here. If you'd like to watch another one, right here. Till next time, I'm Jake. This is RattlesnakeTV, keeping you armed and dangerous.